It's not just on the battlefield. Tensions also persist on the business front. China has restricted the export of rare earth magnets to all nations. However, an exception has been made for US and European firms. Requests from the Indian companies have not been addressed yet. China has also restricted the export of specialty fertilizers to India. Chinese technicians have also exited the Apple supply chain and electronics manufacturing in India. Joining us now to discuss this further, chrisbeddor, Deputy Director, China Research at Gavekal Dragonomics. Christopher, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Let me begin by asking you about the superpower competition between the US and China and how much of these economic sanctions that China is now imposing on the rest of the world is because of these trade tensions with the US.
Yeah, so that's a question that's on the mind of a lot of folks, especially in Europe and other capitals around the world. And the answer is, in part, it is due to that. So in particular, what we've seen is that because of the US-China trade conflict, China has taken to weaponizing supply chains for rare earths in particular. They've imposed more export controls, which means that you need licenses to export some rare earth and rare earth magnets. And that's really being felt not just in the United States, but around the world. And in fact, some of the heaviest blows seem to have landed in countries that are not the United States. So I do think that you see some of Beijing's actions that they're taking in response to the United States are actually directed towards other countries.
Right. I would also like to ask you about the kind of tensions that we're seeing with India. Do you think China will further try to tighten the screws as far as the supply chains with India go? First, they stopped rare earth magnets, then specialty fertilizers. They're now pulling out Chinese workers from Foxconn plants in India. Why do you think China is doing this?
It's a great question. So I think that the issue here is that in Beijing's eyes, India is separate from many other countries, especially in Southeast Asia. So what I mean by that is Beijing has its eye on the likes of Vietnam and the likes of Cambodia, Malaysia, and so forth, in part because China wants to continue transshipments of goods from China through these countries to the United States in order to sidestep US tariffs. That calculus is really different when it comes to India. To be blunt, someplace like Cambodia or Vietnam is not going to become a manufacturing powerhouse to really rival China. But that is not true for India. India conceivably could, especially over a long period of time. So what you see is that Beijing's approach to India is quite different from other countries, where it is much more cognizant of the fact that places like Foxconn could take technology, it could take individuals from China, bring them over and build up India's manufacturing base. And that could potentially pose a long-term threat to China's manufacturing prowess.
All right. I would also like to ask you that after Vietnam, if US were to have an interim or mini trade deal with India, which is now looking quite likely, Trump has also said that there may be a deal with India very soon. Do you think that could worsen India's relations with China economically?
In the short term, I would say it probably wouldn't have a major impact. The reason being is that there's a lot of countries, again, Vietnam is sort of the archetypal example, where China is deeply invested in what trade deal they have with the United States because of transshipping. It wants to keep at least some transshipment going. And more broadly, it looks after Chinese companies that have invested a lot in these jurisdictions. But that's not quite true with India. India is not a major transshipment hub for Chinese goods flowing to the United States. So in the immediate term, it might not lead to this massive impact. I think that the concern would be in the longer term, that if the trade, the dust settles on the trade disputes and we get several deals coming through, and it looks like after some period of time that the Trump administration has really gone hard on China, but it's sort of pulled its punches on India because it views India as a potential bulwark against China in the long term. That could sow a lot more friction between China and India. I don't think we're there yet, but that is something that to keep an eye on in the horizon.
Right. What do you think is going to be the larger impact of the current geopolitical tensions? I'd like to just draw your attention to what the India Deputy Chief of Army Staff said today. For the first time, he clearly outlined the support that Pakistan got from China. He literally said that during Operation Sindoor, China was providing live operational updates, live vectors, intelligence to Pakistan, how almost 60 to 70% of their weaponry is coming from China, how they're getting weaponry from Turkey as well. And Pakistan has literally become a testing laboratory of Chinese weapons. Looking at the kind of weapons and the kind of support that China gave to Pakistan in the current conflict and clandestinely, what is the larger economic worry for India and the challenges that India should be ready for?
Yeah, I think that there's clearly a challenge here over the long term between geopolitically between India and China. That's not, of course, new. It's been going on for several years. And I think that it's reasonable to think that it will just intensify, especially as India increases economically. To be honest, that the United States has sort of always seen India as a potential bulwark against China and tries to draw closer to it. So this is something that's really been on the mind of Beijing policymakers for, basically 2 decades at this point, but especially after in Trump's first administration, especially after the Quad was assembled, especially after the border disputes with India. It's really something that's kind of become more prominent over the years. And there's just no reason to think that these tensions are going to subside in the long term. In any given month or any given year, the needle might tick down in terms of the tensions. It might ease a little bit, but over the long term, it's really hard to see how there's sort of this very stable equilibrium. Again, especially with the United States looking to sort of shore up its alliances. And occasionally take action in conjunction with allies against China.
Right. As someone who is a very close China watcher, Christopher, how do you think China is going to strengthen itself because of the kind of restrictions and challenges that the United States is posing right now? Also, their attempts to diversify away from China. Do you think China could take more steps in order to restrict companies from moving out? Impose more restrictions on items such as rare earth magnets, semiconductors, specialty fertilizers in order to hurt global supply chains?
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely it could. It definitely, one of its most powerful cards that it has to play is rare earths. And so we've of course already seen action on that to restrict rare earth supplies to the rest of the world. And that is that's proven a very potent weapon. It's inflicted a lot of damage, or at least threatened to inflict a lot of damage on countries around the world. So it's reasonable to think that if, say, trade negotiations, obviously there's currently a ceasefire between China and the United States, if that were to break down, if negotiations go sideways, very reasonable to think that China could turn back to that. The issue with rare earths is that it's sort of a very potent short-term weapon that diminishes over time, simply because by using it, you catalyze other countries to attempt to pool their resources to get supply chains out of China. So it's really, it's something that works incredibly well, maybe for a year or two. But then if you really want to lean on that tool, it might stop working after 5-10 years, something like that. Not to say that getting from point A to point B for other countries is going to be easy, but they will look to do that. And then, more broadly, I think that China is concerned about some degree of technology flowing from its borders, from its manufacturing facilities to other countries. So not just India, but we've seen in other areas, most notably the electronic vehicle space, that China has taken actions as other countries have looked to encourage Chinese firms to set up production. So not exporting the car from China to the domestic market, wherever that might be, but actually getting the likes of BYD and other companies to set up production facilities. China has grown skittish about how much of that technology is flowing abroad and whether that might pose some sort of threat to its manufacturing base at home. So I think these are all very serious concerns, and it's reasonable to think that China will take more actions in that space in the future.
All right. Thank you, Christopher, for joining us on the program. That's all we have for tonight's Global Lens. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.